Verde que te quiero verde, verde viento, verdes ramas, el barco sobre el mar y el caballo en la montaña. Con la sombra en la cintura, ella sueña en su baranda, verde carne, pelo verde, con ojos de fría plata. Verde que te quiero verde, bajo la luna gitana, las cosas están mirando y ella no puede mirarlas. Verde que te quiero verde, grandes estrellas de escarcha, vienen en el pez de sombra que abre el camino del alba. La higuera flota en su viento con la lija de sus ramas. El monte gato garruño eriza sus pitas agrias. Pero ¿quién vendrá? ¿Y por dónde? Ella sigue en su baranda, verde carne, pelo verde, soñando en su niña amarga. Compadre, quiero cambiar mi caballo por su casa, mi montura por su espejo, mi cuchillo por su manta. Compadre, vengo sangrando desde los puertos de Cabo. Si yo pudiera, amorcito, este trato se cerraba. Pero ya yo no soy yo y mi casa es mi casa. Compadre, quiero morir decentemente en mi cama, de acero, si se puede ser, con las sábanas de Holanda. ¿No ves que la herida que tengo desde el pecho a la garganta? 300 rosas morenas llevan la perchera blanca. Tu sangre resuma y huele alrededor de tu faja. Pero ya yo no soy yo, ni mi casa es mi casa. Dejadme subir al menos hasta las altas barandas. Dejadme subir, dejadme hasta las verdes barandas. Barandales de la luna por donde se retumba el agua y suben en los compadres en sus pequeñas barandas. Dejadme el rastro de sangre, dejando el rastro de lágrimas. Templaban en los tejados, farolitos de hojalata. Mis banderas son de criminal y de guerra de madrugada. Verde que te quiero verde, verde viento, verdes ramas. Los dos compadres subieron, el largo viento dejaba en la boca un raro gusto de miel, de menta y de albahaca. Compadre, ¿dónde está? Dime dónde está tu niña amarga. ¿Cuántas veces espero? ¿Cuántas veces esperará? Casa fresca, negro pelo, con esa verde baranda. Sobre el rostro de aljibe se mezcla la gitana, verde carne, pelo verde con ojos de piel de fría plata. Un carámbano de luna la sostiene sobre el agua. La noche se puso lástima como una pequeña plaza. Guardias civiles borrachos en la puerta golpeaban. Verde que te quiero verde, verde viento, verdes ramas, el barco sobre la mar y el caballo sobre la montaña. I have read this poem by Federico Garcia Lorca as a point of entry to make visible how I come about the work that I do. That in repeating verde que te quiero verde, green how I want you green, I am to instigate a motion into the workflow of a mental ecology, of an environmental form. As I put the most effort in producing work that has no interior, that is all exterior, I start this video that played behind me. It was a component of a larger installation titled Non-Spheres 4, and it was done as a public art workshop I conducted with students of art and architecture at the Center of Contemporary Art of Afghanistan in Kabul. Non-Spheres 4 was in large part informed by a text that I came across as I was finishing my thesis work at MIT in 2006. This text is from the essay Acid Visions by Felicity Scott, published in the 23rd issue of Grey Room on the spring of that year, and it reads, despite being haunted by the, I need the lighting, sorry. I really can't see. Thank you. Despite being haunted by the end games of the Cold War, Drug City's end would not be the result of nuclear catastrophe, but of its inscription into the media. Toward the end of his memoirs, Peter Rabbit concedes his own role in bringing the community down by inciting the hordes. We gotta get out there and hustle, man. We gotta get some publicity and people will lay bread on us. This was from Time, Art, News, the Astrodome, Color TV. We gotta get it on, man. And he succeeded in capturing the media attention to the point where, as he put it, we got lost and reflected in the image of ourselves. We were making a big splash. But the drug city functioned all too effectively without Media America, with its experimental domes, geodesic domes, serving to promote Buckminster Fuller's invention of the counterculture. The commune's ambitions had been quite distinct. It had aimed to articulate a dissident and political refusal of American and hence global capitalism. Although domes, not quite architecture, to cite Daniel Bannon's formulation, such alternative critiques of architecture and urbanism, which functioned at the nexus of the spectacle and use, raised the question of how architecture might escape from this technological condition, an impossible and not entirely progressive ideal, but of what sort of ethical and political strategies might remain open as modes of encountering with it. These historical practices point to the danger not only of mysticism, but also of an unwitting integration into contemporary articulations of geopolitics and digital tools. I stress unwitting to distinguish modes of experimentation from the savvy, even self-conscious strategies of uncritical integration that gave rise to, among other recent events in architecture, the Bilbao effect. This paragraph, that in itself is hardly a conclusion, but a deployment, reminded me of the work I had been doing for a few years earlier with Gene Garner and Paul Ryan on hippie counterculture and alternative education in the United States, which led me to Black Mountain College and Buckminster Fuller. The reading of Felicity's lucid call to arms of how easily socially driven technology and architectural production can become instrumentalized by the state, whether in the form of military, business, and/or government, left me in a delightful state of concern. Most specifically, it was her and Hal Foster's staunch characterization of Frank Gehry's little fish, Bilbao, the Guggenheim, of course, as being deeply embedded in my thesis work. As being an unchecked misappropriation of digital fabrication and parametrics, concerns deeply embedded in my thesis work about the unwitting implementation of technology in cultural and architectural production. As I left the warm bosom of MIT and as I arrived into Berlin that same year of 2006, on my way to Afghanistan, I am brought to Teufelsberg. Never could I have ever imagined that the instrumentalization of Fuller's geodesics would ever be manifested as a fish the size of a gigantic penis with hairy testicles on top of the ruins of the Second World War. You can never ever underestimate the sense of humor of the American military, because this place is actually where the ruins of the Second World War are. It's a landfill, and this giant penis is on top of it. This phallic hubris reminded me of how delicate innovation can be, how it also reminded me of the uncanny amnesia that the state is able to induce, even by applying the most ethically and morally offensive techniques. Therefore, given the geopolitical phantasmagoria of the Cold War in Berlin and the ensuing tragic victimization of Afghanistan, I decided to unfold this gigantic penis in order to make visible what is still my current spatial trajectory. I used the abstract prop of the relational circuit created by Paul Ryan, American semiotician and seminal video artist in the late 60s, as I move on to read the following statement. General abduction. Despite the desires to the contrary, there is little evidence pointing to the passing of modernity. To confront this notion, I propose to build a mannerist context for cultural production. The aim of this context is to set forth an array of parameters to make visible this modern stasis. There is no purpose in to crystallize a style out of this construction, but to remind the delightful complex of self-inquiry, of those interrogative practices that seem to be consumed by the oceanic void of free market capitalism. Let's say that this productive array becomes visible by way of differentiating architectonic from architectural. This difference is required when considering the compound mixture of meaning propagated by postmodernity. This endemic hodgepodge originated from the very same intent to dismantle the industrial narrative of the 20th century. More specifically, it has been a concerted effort that in large part relied on stylistic bricolage and mass media in order to, among other purposes, blur those fissures of disciplinarity, fragmentation, of specialization that have been fundamental to the Fordist ideology. But this effort has become subject to its own resistance, by increasingly depending on the armchair monologue that has unwittingly reverted onto itself, leaving behind a vast undiscernible phantasmagoric wasteland. At many levels, this intent can be traced to the activism associated with general intellect, aiming to generate confrontations against and infiltrations within religious indoctrination, exploitative labor, modes of production, exploitative labor, and the vacuum of knowledge that ensued from the late 19th century modes of production on through 20th century professionalist individualization. In that spirit, one can certainly continue to side with the broadening of knowledge through collectivity and experimentation, but the problematic byproduct of this broadening has increasingly become prey to the dilettante and to the rendered image. Disappointingly, this surfacing has done little to change its intended purpose, if to perpetuate and even strengthen the resolve of mass industry, most evident in the re-entwining of military and religious fanatism with resource and social exploitation. This well-known phantasmagoric nature and of an inability to discern the real from illusion has collapsed into absurd discussions, more presently the irrational negation of evolutionary theory and the passively suicidal impact of human agency on climate change. And thus, as any unresolved wasteland, it is a moment and a site full of potential, a terrain vague that can fruitfully inspire and mobilize previously unsought dialogue. Unsought because, despite that there is a clearly cyclical nature to this recurrence, computational and communication technologies do in fact formulate a previously unseen landscape. Therefore, the concerted effort here before you is a network, or rather a concatenation, a discernible argument to review this polemical wasteland. And in its contemplation, a lingering provocation is devised, to remind the division between architectural and architectonic as a manner and method to reconfigure the socio-economic disparities that professionalist artists, curators, and architects have and continue to foment. The absence of doubt, the absence of self-inquiry, and even irony that for us, by far and in large, has sucked alive the delectability out of artistic sovereignty. For example, buildings regardless of construction technique are most exciting as exploration, not necessarily as a scientific research as aesthetic, but as a discrete reflection of where even the physical manifestations lead to a simulation of a style and of an ideology. This reflection could be easily disregarded as stylistic replication or as a response to social political pressure, which in one way or another may be so, but in the end, for those who have gained enough empirical currency to see through the evidence strata of art and architectural production, sense an honest if forthcoming submission to the greater pedagogical and thus an epistemological process of practice, an architectonic where building precedes the artwork. Now let's be clear, I am not calling for a historicism that was so pervasive during those postmodern years, the cocaine years, but of a continuity, or to use Charles Peirce's term, a cynicism, an approach that tactically leans on the hypotheses as the principal evolutionary mechanism. With that rhythm Here I call upon an architectonic that flows between transcendental and the mechanistic tendencies, so to deduce spatial phenomena by suspending the particularities of an initial mass into the monads that we come to understand as a construct. It is the correlation of these particularities within a building or an entire body of work that just as light is intrinsic to color, scale is intrinsic to density, ultimately manifested by a mastery of the tact, not necessarily through iconic work, nor communal space itself, but more so to the elusive space that is collective mind, as the monster of precarious life that blossoms through scenography, its implicit semiotic. The system of symbols we want to remind are drawn from a parallel triptych that was the identidad, or continuity, or the eternal return, or rather Bergson's insistence on intuition as the ever-novel reptilian nerve pierces originless topology of the community of inquiry, and or Nietzsche's delineation of meta-intervals, all rooted in a cosmological mindfuck that is Kant's transcendental object. As we become increasingly aware of the character of this architectonic being laid here before you, those shape a process for an epistemic, a manner that does not condemn us to a world of illusion, but to the abstract determinism, to the abstract world of position takings. You will find here a parametric determinism where we can finally depart from the passive suicidal biospheric severance imparted by the modern industrial project and begin to seem into a far more articulate life we can now discern by stretching the technological envelopes that allow the contracts of citizenship, to quote Wadai, to continue to flow elusively embodied in our natural laws. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lukas. Now we're entering actually the performance, really, in the most literal sense from the talks we had before into actual performance. Where to start? Maybe we can, or maybe you could help me out. And the title of your talk was Matters Berríos in Gay Science, or Berríos Matters Gay Science, to give us kind of more a clue where you come with these three terms that I was kind of thinking about. In one way, maybe manners, as we defined as the social behavior, or refined social behavior of a person, but as also as somehow like a conduct or a type. Parameter, maybe, I wrote a few things down, is maybe a criterion or framework, but it's also that the outer boundaries of an area, like a parameter. And last but not least, gay science, which is a reference to Nietzsche's Wissenschaften, and the English translation is the gay science. Which again, I was thinking the gay science comes from Gaia Scienza, from Geisterperlen, which is like a medieval idea originally, as far as I know, from the 14th century, which really described the school of poetry. Your presentation was very poetic in its whole sense, from your performance here on the floor to the images and the reading of the poem, the beginning of your text yourself. Help me out to combine these things and where you're going here.
Yeah.
With the microphone.
Yes. Again, I relate to I point to the relational circuit with Paul Ryan's, because I mentioned it's a semiotician, an American semiotician, who was part of this crew in the 60s and 70s called Radical Software. And in order to deal with what he called was the schismogenesis, the fracture of the relationship between the human project and the natural environment. He wanted to deal with that dyadic, or that confrontation of two bodies, and bring it to a third element. And he was inspired by the three categories of pairs: the firstness, secondness, and thirdness. In this talk, I used the relational circuit as a prop, as an abstract prop to try to bring you guys into what I'm trying to combat and trying to struggle with in my practice. I start in the position of secondness parameters. I'm terribly concerned about the way parametricism is being fomented in architectural education. very similarly to the misappropriation of cybernetics also through control and electronic media like parametrics. In fact, when like Ernest Mandel, the Marxist philosopher, calls upon parametric determinism as a greater system of relationships in society, that I think that that's the kind of thinking that we should be using when we refer to parameters and parametrics, not just strictly the use of digital fabrication in small production and in large scale production. Manners, because Arnold Hauser in the social history of art makes a beautiful, what I think is a beautiful parallel with how during mannerism, in order to destroy classical order and in order to challenge the notion of impending doom that was pervasive after the Quattrocento, this idea of getting rid of style and engaging in manera, in the action of exaggeration, of confronting, of dismantling the system, sounds remarkably similar to the lack of definition that we have today when it comes to architectural practice and artistic practice. We're not quite sure what's going on. And I think mannerism was that kind of theory that was categorized as such posthumously, hundreds of years later. This period was not defined until much later. So I think that that's kind of the environment we are, and to fight against style. And lastly, the gay science, I'm just simply questioning the facile way we deal with research, and to think about what is the purpose, what really is the purpose of research as production, and how Nietzsche's conception and Emerson's conception before him about the Scienza Gaia, that is not just relying on positivism, on scientific data, that there is still greater understanding, greater energies that we're not quite completely sure. And that's where in the end, that's, I don't want to get too into this, but the transcendental object and the origin of ideas, no? And that's where the eternal recurrence comes in, burning. And I think that's a very productive possibility in today's context.
Okay, thank you. And so here, shortly before I pass the mic, interesting enough, again, we're coming up with ideas that have been around for the last 30, 40 years. And interesting enough, she chose gay science as a title. I think this is, if I'm correct, the first book where the first consideration of the concept of the eternal recurrence appears in Nietzsche's work. Anyways, but that's a side job. Jane, you have a question.
I'm not sure if it's a question exactly. It's very provoking and really interesting, and I particularly like the way that it began. I think that was very, very poetic, and it kind of moved the tone of the conference, so I really appreciate that. Just picking up maybe on the point that you were raising about parametrics, and I don't want this to become a conversation about parametrics necessarily, but I have concerns about parametrics being used as form making, which doesn't relate necessarily to cultural specifics or historical specifics. But there is this aspect of parametrics which has begun to really fascinate me, and that's the part that relates to topology, and the part that then, for me, through topology, relates to psychoanalysis and Lacan's work, which was very much structured around threes, but also arguably around fours, but threes, the symbolic, the real, the imaginary. And he was fascinated by knots, different kinds of knots, the Borromini knot where you have circles that interlock, the Möbius strip and so on. So his interest, and we touched on this yesterday a little bit, in topologies of the mind in a sense, the psychic structure, I think is really interesting. And I guess I was thinking of Guattari's three ecologies, and how he's relating the kind of material, the cultural and the psychic as well, that within the ecological crisis right now, we can't simply respond through materiality. There has to be an element of dealing with change, and I think there has to be an element of psychic change, because the problem is the problem of addiction, actually, at a certain level. So I think I think that's maybe some of the interest that I have in what you're talking about, how it relates to my field of interest. And I think there's fantastic work at the moment in psychoanalysis, some of which deals with to do with thirds in relationships, whether it's the 3 in 1, that between two people, the relationship is the third element, or whether in looking at kind of Oedipal relationships, the child looking onto the relationship between parents, for example, is another third. So these things start to be specific, not necessarily historically, though we could make them historical if we wanted to do a kind of Marxist positioning on it, but they're specific in terms of actual relations. Where I get more kind of nervous, and for me it's always been a problem of what happens if you try and put Jung and Marx together, is at the level of the archetype.
Yeah.
So I guess you were talking about critique of capitalism, but you're also working with archetypal, sometimes unconscious collective forms that appear not to be historically situated. So my question, I guess, finally got there, is how you put these two things together. I'm kind of intrigued.
Yeah, I mean, let me start by saying that the biggest battleground for me is the dematerialization of public space. I argue that it's gone, in fact. And my work with Paul Ryan for Documenta 13, he has been developing for the past 40 years a technique that he calls freeing, which is based on, initially was used as a mechanism to deal with community living in the 60s, or the hippie communes, to deal with jealousy, to deal with the ménage à trois, to deal with how to raise children in a community. And this dynamic, he has been completely obsessed with it for the past 40 years. And I've been lucky enough to meet Paul and his partner Gene in New York when I was in art school at Parsons, and they've included me in this project that he's doing in Documenta. I designed this. I don't know if you saw it. This house is it's just finished in Kassel that I designed for this as a space for the performances, and then I also produced these rugs. The rugs are how I mediate this. This is where the theatrical object, in my mind, starts working in. The semiotics and scenography, the depth of this field, I think is incredibly fruitful to deal with the dissolution of public space and to manage this chasm that you were referring to. And so these rugs are not only the magic carpets that I've been developing, which are on about 10 of them now that I weave in Peru, but then the three rugs that will be exhibited in Documenta as part, not only as art objects, but also as performative objects for the dynamics. Yeah.
So they're operating as relational objects to come back to objects.
Yeah, I think that could be one manifestation of it for sure. Yeah.
I think maybe to continue this conversation that you've been having, I'm curious about how there's the critical writer and then there's the critical reader. So you were saying that with parametrics you're critical of its use and its kind of aestheticization, and that people are unaware of the kind of political or institutional structures that are behind it. How is this made? And I see the reading that you're giving to the rugs and the kind of performative aspect, and that can kind of deter certain kind of public rituals and make us think about space in a different way. But how, for let's say the exhibition, the gallery, and I kind of know so that we can talk about it a little bit more. But the exhibition that you showed at Program, you used parametrics to design the whole thing. Yet it was a critique of it at the same time. What are some of the strategies through space, through kind of installation, have you employed to kind of show the critique to an audience, to make a critical reader rather than
in a material way? The exhibition with you program was strictly this idea of unfolding the penis, of unfolding the geodesic structure into this lattice, this three-dimensional, not surface system, about a three-dimensional system that hopefully made a reference to neurological connections and historical connections. I think that parametrics and allowing ourselves to understand parametrics as a tool for those purposes is a far more fruitful endeavor than strictly using it for formal and sculptural practice. And that's where I really get very concerned when we hear Schumacher and his cohorts even making Marxist references to this absolute incredibly irresponsible approach to how it impacts the free market mentality and how it accelerates it, and how it's a big concern. My way to deal with it is the turtle. I donate the turtle for events or to organizations like the Beta House or the Open Design City, the Deutsche Architekturzentrum program, as another prop that was also developed parametrically to mediate the, not only cultural interface as a mobile unit, as a war machine, but also to promote mass customization, the transition from a mass industrialized society to a mass customized society, which I think, similarly to Valentin's position of localization, I think these are potentially parallel and potentially collaborative structures that could be explored that are still not to be explored. Very different from staging protest, I think. Far more productive, by the way. And that's, I think, that's how we'll deal with it.
Thank you very much, Luis. We will keep our questions.
Can I just very briefly say thank you, Lukas, for everything. For the great work. Thank you.